Hey guys, welcome back to another video that is not War of the Visions, but today I will be doing a Final Fantasy tier list video, which covers most of the mainline games except the sequels, some remakes, some spin-off games, and the MMOs, but I do have some bonus ones such as Type-0, Crisis Core, and Tactics, so that is why I'm using this tier list specifically. So, my journey with Final Fantasy is, well, over the past 2 years, I've been playing them very slowly, and my first experience with a Final Fantasy game was actually my very first video on this channel, which was Final Fantasy VII.
Barret can only last 2 hits at most. Never mind, he lasted 1 hit. Wow. Well, death number 1. It's death number 1 right there.
And before Final Fantasy VII, I played Final Fantasy Brave Exvius, the mobile game, which does have a lot of characters from the different Final Fantasies, so I did know some characters going into the franchise. And before FFBE, however, my only experience with Final Fantasy were the iconic characters such as Cloud, Sephiroth, maybe like Tidus and Squall as well. But other than that, I really did not know any other games beside like 7, 10, and that's really it. So I went on this entire journey throughout these past 2 years, and I'll just put up a play order in the way I played it right now. And if you're looking at my play order, you're probably like, what the hell is this order? And I don't even know myself, but I'm just putting it up just in case there might be some recency bias in my rankings. But yeah, today we have 6 different tiers. We have the best, which is the best game in my opinion. We have amazing, great, good, okay, and bad. And didn't play already filled out, so you can already see I didn't play the MMOs, some spin-offs, the sequels, and FF7 remake. So yeah, this is the list we'll be working with today, so let's get right in. Okay, so starting off with the bad, the very worst of the worst, in my opinion, once again. I also forgot to say, this tier list is a bit mild spoilers. I won't say any major spoilers, but just a bit mild spoilers just to get my thoughts out. So, we will be starting with the worst of the worst. The worst Final Fantasy game, in my opinion, has to be Final Fantasy XIII. Now, I did play Final Fantasy XIII on Steam, and if you look at the reviews on there, there's a lot of people complaining about the port, which I didn't find any problems with personally. But my 4 main problems with Final Fantasy XIII is, number 1, everyone says this, but it is extremely linear. And I know it does open up later into the story, but even then, it's just a plane of emptiness. Because going into my next problem is that there were no towns or NPCs whatsoever to talk to. Even when you entered like the Nautilus, which is basically the golden saucer equivalent to Final Fantasy VII, it was just one big hallway. There were no mini games. There were no NPCs to talk to. All you could really do is walk up to NPCs and eavesdrop on their conversation. There were no towns to walk into to buy items or weapons, and they were all just pushed into the save point, which really felt empty to me. And I know the story is about like fugitives running away, but like, come on, you know? And my third problem is that the characters were pretty mediocre in my opinion. I did like Hope in chapter 7 when he got his like character arc, and yeah. And my fourth problem with Final Fantasy 13 is that the battle system, I liked it. I thought it was pretty interactive, but I thought it was also pretty repetitive because I did play on the computer with mouse and keyboard, and all I really did was constantly left click on auto battle, and periodically I would switch it up a bit by choosing abilities with the paradigm system, but other than that, it was just really left click simulator. And finally, my last problem with Final Fantasy 13 is that a lot of like the bonus stuff, I wouldn't even call it bonus stuff, is locked behind side quests. Like getting a chocobo, getting like an additional upgrade component shop, the R&D department, and then getting waypoints or teleportation stones is all locked behind side quests. And I'm not a side quest type of person, so I only did a handful of them. But then once I got near the end of the game, I realized I needed to do those side quests in order to properly upgrade my gear or be able to teleport back to the big open world. But you did eventually get to teleport back regardless if you didn't clear the side quests or not. So yeah, lots of problems with Final Fantasy 13 for me. I do think some of the music is nice and it's very graphically good for 2010-2009 game for now, and yeah, but for me it's just the worst Final Fantasy in my opinion. Okay, so next up after Final Fantasy 13, I'm pretty sure everyone will see this coming, but it is Final Fantasy 2. Now, Final Fantasy 2, I did play on a PSP emulator, so it is a bit more graphically updated, and it did have that CGI cutscene. And going into it, I genuinely wanted to like it. And just because before playing it, I listened to Castle Pandemonium, the PSP version, and I thought it was amazing. And I thought, wow, how could anyone hate this game when the music is this good? And yeah, I really wanted to like it going into it, but at the end of the day, my main problem with it was that the main cast, Firion, Guy, Maria, and Leon, were just so bad. Because you only learn two things about the main cast throughout the entire game. You learn that Maria and Leon are siblings, and you learn that Guy speaks Beaver. Like, you don't even learn anything about Firion. And I think Firion, design-wise, looks pretty awesome. Especially his, like, the Cydia version, he looks very nice. And the password system with Final Fantasy II was also pretty interesting. But it did end up cutting me some content with, like, Rickard and the boy who wanted to see Dragoons or something. And yeah, the password system was a bit questionable. But I think a lot of people who like Final Fantasy II probably look more towards the side characters with like Yosef, Minwu, and Gordon. And I thought they were okay. And they were pretty good like factors into the story. But other than that, I think just because the main cast is so bad, that was the deciding factor for me for Final Fantasy II. So yeah, Final Fantasy II is in the bad tier. Now for the final bad tier game, in my opinion, it would have to be Final Fantasy VI. Just kidding. But it is Final Fantasy I. Now, Final Fantasy I, I did also play on a PSP emulator, and it was graphically updated as well, similar to 2. And Final Fantasy I is just your very standard JRPG, in my opinion, but it did not age well. Just because it's so, how would I say it, bland, I guess. Even now, I barely remember what happened in the story, and I think a lot of people usually place Final Fantasy I higher on their tier list just because of nostalgia factor, but there was no nostalgia for me whatsoever because I played all these games in a 2-year period, and yeah, not many words for Final Fantasy I, but it did start off the whole franchise, and it did save Square from going bankrupt, so that is an accomplishment in and of itself. So Final Fantasy I goes on top of bad tier. Not bad, I guess. So, going into the okay tier, we have 2 games that are a bit similar to each other, but the first game going at the bottom of the okay tier will have to go to Final Fantasy III. And once again, I did play the PSP version of Final Fantasy III, so it is the same one as the DS version as well. So there are some characters, some names added to it, not just Onion Kids. So we did have like Lunaf, Arc, I forgot the other 2, but Luna and Arc, you get the idea. They have some names now, but still they were a bit bland in my opinion, as you can already tell because I already forgot 2 of their names. But the redeeming factor for Final Fantasy III was definitely the job system. I did have a lot of fun with the job system in Final Fantasy III, even though there aren't a lot of jobs, only a handful of jobs to pick from. I did like using like the Dragoon, Red Mage, Monk, and jobs like that. But other than that, not much else to say for Final Fantasy III. Now, going from Final Fantasy III is going to be Final Fantasy V. Now, Final Fantasy III and V, I did say they were similar to each other, just because I think their job systems were definitely the most expansive in the franchise, and Final Fantasy V just took Final Fantasy III a step beyond, and I think they really improved with it. And I did play Final Fantasy V on the SNES, and I think the characters definitely got more personality to them, but again, I think they were a bit one note, with like Ferris being the tomboy of the group, Lena being the princess and all, and then Bart and Galoof were like the pervy dudes that hit off with each other. I don't know. But yeah, Final Fantasy V wasn't that bad, and as for like the story, if you know what I'm talking about, the Galoof part was pretty good in my opinion, but I think the most redeeming factor for Final Fantasy V was definitely Gilgamesh and Battle on the Big Bridge. Those 2 aspects were definitely the best parts to Final Fantasy V. I loved Gilgamesh. He was amazing throughout the entire story, and Battle on the Big Bridge as an OST is just amazing. So, Final Fantasy V tops out the OK tier. Okay, so going into the good tier level of this tier list, there are also 2 games only in this level, and the first one at the bottom of good tier has to go to Final Fantasy Type-0. Now, Final Fantasy Type-0 I did play on the PSP, and for the story, it was very raw and bloody in my opinion. I think it was the most bloodiest Final Fantasy out of all of these, I think. And the music was pretty good as well. I think Fires of Suzaku is my favorite OST out of the game. But yeah, the gameplay style was definitely different just because it's a PSP game, and I think Crisis Core shares a similar factor. But other than that, like the mission style too was a bit different. It was like go to the academy, accept a mission, go to the mission, go back to the academy, and then repeat. I thought that was a bit repetitive, which placed it lower in this tier list, but Class 0 as a whole was pretty good. The story was good, and that is why it is in the good tier. So Type-0, good. Now to top off the good tier, it is going to be Final Fantasy IV. Now, Final Fantasy IV, I did play on Steam. It was my second game after Final Fantasy VII. And if, like, jump back to when Final Fantasy IV released, if you only played Final Fantasy II, or 1, 2, and 3, and then 4 came out, I think Final Fantasy IV was groundbreaking. Cause I wouldn't know, cause I wasn't there. But I think Final Fantasy IV is definitely the first Final Fantasy with some real story, some real characters to it. And it's probably a huge leap from 1, 2, and 3. If you were following the Final Fantasy franchise since the beginning. And in my opinion, I think the story was very soap opera, very dramatic, and it is probably the most dramatic Final Fantasy out of all of these games, in my opinion. And that could be a good and bad thing, because it might be over the top sometimes, but those moments really stood out to me, even today. And music for Final Fantasy IV is very, very nice, especially the Red Baron theme and Theme of Love. Those are the ones that stick out for me. And yeah, Final Fantasy IV is a very good game, hence it is the top of the good tier. Alright, going into the great tier now, we have a lot of different games in here. But to start it off, in the bottom of the great tier, we have Final Fantasy VII, the first game I played in the entire franchise. And I did play this on Steam, so it was a tad bit better graphically, but there were still polygons to it. And when I finished Final Fantasy VII, I thought it was a really solid game for its time, being like a 1990s game. And when I played it, 2020, I thought it was pretty good for its time. And even now, it's pretty good. It's very iconic, and I think it definitely got the whole entire Final Fantasy franchise on the map in the gaming circle. And of course, Cloud and Sephiroth are very iconic. The Aerith scene also very iconic. And overall, the story was good, but I did think Cloud's whole self-identity thing was a bit much, and Sephiroth's also self-identity thing was also a bit much. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII, a great game, a good game, and very, very good to play even today. You don't even need to play the remake because the remake is going to be in different parts. Who knows how many parts? 4, 3, and the remake story is also different. I know that much. So yeah, Final Fantasy VII, bottom of the great tier. Now, next up in the great tier is going to be our next bonus game, which is Final Fantasy Tactics. Now, Final Fantasy Tactics, I did play on the PSP, so it was War of the Lions, Final Fantasy Tactics, and the story to Final Fantasy Tactics is just a very, very rich story. It's very political and religious in some parts, which I think just added like that special spice to it. And just overall, the story to Final Fantasy Tactics is really good. And for characters, the Lita, I think the Lita is one of the best anti-heroes in the entire franchise. I think even today, a lot of people argue whether or not the Lita is a good or bad guy. I personally think he is a bad guy, but some other people might say he's a good guy, so that is what makes the Lita so good. And as for Ramza, a lot of people also argue that Ramza is the best protagonist in the entire franchise, and I can definitely see that because Ramza has a lot of attributes that are very protagonist worthy. And of course, there are other characters as well, such as Beowulf, Agrias, Delita, Mustadio, Wygarth, a lot of good different side characters in the game as well. And even though the gameplay is different, don't make that stop you from playing it, because Final Fantasy Tactics is a really good game. So next up, after Final Fantasy Tactics, has to be Final Fantasy IX. Now, Final Fantasy IX, I did play on a PS1 emulator with some upgraded graphics, so it was pretty good on the emulator actually. And FF9 is a very classic Final Fantasy, as a lot of people say. And for the graphic style, a lot of people complain about the graphic style for being too cartoonish, but I do think the graphic style to Final Fantasy IX fit it perfectly, just because like that whole medieval setting really works for it, I think. And the music to Final Fantasy IX was pretty good, especially like Melodies of Life and You Are Not Alone. Those are some soundtracks that stand out for me. And I think if how do I say this? I think for Final Fantasy IX, it hits hard for a lot of people when it comes to Zidane's You Are Not Alone moment, but I think it didn't hit me as hard, which is why it's a bit lower on this tier list. But I do think that if it hit harder for me, it would definitely be higher. But other than that, the ending to Final Fantasy IX was pretty good as well. Really satisfying ending, almost made me cry, just almost. But Final Fantasy IX, pretty good as well. Alright, so for the last game in the great tier, some of you are probably going to hate me for this, but it has to be Final Fantasy 15. Now, Final Fantasy 15 may have some recency bias in here, but I just think Final Fantasy 15 worked amazingly. And I did play on Steam with all the DLCs except the Comrades one. So I did play all the DLCs, get more marination marination with the characters, get more like side stories up in there. And Final Fantasy 15 was actually one of the Final Fantasies that made me cry. So that has it going for it. And the main cast of Final Fantasy 15 has 4 main characters, or 1 main character, 3 side characters, which was Noctis, Prompto, Gladio, and Ignis. And since the cast was just so small, I think the story did amazingly to develop them all. And maybe except Gladio. Gladio was a bit weaker in my opinion, but for Noctis, Prompto, and Ignis, they were great in the entire game. Now, a lot of people definitely complain about Lunafreya and like the second half of the game for being linear, and I definitely agree on that. Those were some pretty big weak points, but just like the open world moments in the game where you camp out with the bros, you have these small moments with the bros. You wake up in the early morning, cook with them, run with them. It just developed them in a whole nother factor. And the voice acting in the game was also really, really emotional, really good. And for me, the strongest part about Final Fantasy 15 were the 4 bros. And yeah, the music to Final Fantasy 15 was also really strong, really nice, with like Apocalypse's Noctis, or Bros on the Road, or the different battle themes. So really good, despite it not being Nobuo Uematsu. The music to Final Fantasy 15 was also really great. And I'm sorry if I put it above 7 Tactics and 9. Yeah. Now going into the amazing tier. We are in the amazing territory now. We will start off with Crisis Core, Final Fantasy VII. Now, Crisis Core, I did play on the PSP. I think it's only available on the PSP. So, for the story to Crisis Core, I almost cried to Crisis Core at the end, and it was an inevitable story, but Zack Fair is just such an amazing character and is miles better than Cloud in my opinion, so I'm pretty excited to see what happens in the remake. And for the music, Crisis Core actually uses a lot of acoustics, and I think that makes it stand out musically from the others in the entire franchise. So a lot of acoustics in its OST. I thought that was pretty interesting. And the gameplay to it, I did say Type-0 and Crisis Core shared similar aspects to gameplay because they were PSP games, but Crisis Core was a bit more simple, I think. I felt like it was a bit more simple, and I really liked it because it was pretty smooth and pretty fun to play with. So Crisis Core goes to the amazing tier. Now, next up in the amazing tier is going to be Final Fantasy X. Now, Final Fantasy X, I did play on the PS2, so it's not the HD remaster. And Final Fantasy X was actually the other Final Fantasy game that made me cry. And I cried even knowing what would happen at the very end already, because of course I watched it on YouTube some clips of it, and yeah, I cried even knowing what was going to happen. And it was the same for Final Fantasy 15. I forgot to say that as well. So both Final Fantasy 15 and Final Fantasy 10 made me cry even though I knew what was going to happen already. That's how well they built up the characters, in my opinion. So Final Fantasy X was a fairly linear game, very linear and similar to Final Fantasy 13, but Final Fantasy X just makes it work. And there's a video out there on YouTube that compares Final Fantasy X and 13 as linear games, and I think that video really explains why 10 works and 13 doesn't. But Final Fantasy X is just miles better in a lot of different aspects, and it really hooks you at the beginning as well, where Tidus is sent through another world, and he finds out that he is in the far future of his own world, which really hooks you into the story. You're just as confused as Tidus, and you're in it for the whole entire plot and the pilgrimage of Yuna. So yeah. As for music, 2 Xanarkin is a beautiful, beautiful piece of music, and there were a lot of leitmotifs throughout the game of 2 Xanarkin as well, which I think really built up for the final moment when it really meant the most. So yeah, Final Fantasy X goes into the amazing tier. Now, to top off the amazing tier, third place in this entire tier list, I would have to give it to Final Fantasy XII. Now, Final Fantasy XII, I did play on the PS2, so no Zodiac Age, no special 2 job system, so only 1 job system, but I didn't really mind in that aspect. And once again, similar to Final Fantasy Tactics, Final Fantasy XII was very, very rich in story. They also share the same worlds in Ivalice, so that might be a thing as well, but it was very rich in story, very political, and I think that made it a really strong entry into the franchise. A lot of people complain about the combat system being like an MMO, but I didn't really mind that. As for characters, my favorite characters were Balthier, Bosch, Ash, Gabranth, Larsa, and Vayne. But there were definitely weak characters such as Pinello and Vaughn. And the story to Final Fantasy XII actually gets compared to Star Wars a lot, which I definitely see that, and that might be a good and bad thing, but I thought it was pretty good, and it was good enough to top off the amazing tier. So, Final Fantasy XII gets 3rd place. And finally, that just leaves me with 2 games for number 1 and number 2, being Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy VIII. And I'm just gonna go ahead and reveal them both right now. So for 2nd place, it is going to be Final Fantasy VI, and for 1st place, it is going to be Final Fantasy VIII. Now, to start off with Final Fantasy VI, I did play on the SNES, so just a tad bit older than 5. I think about 1 or 2 years, since I think they were pumping out Final Fantasy games pretty fast back then. But yeah, I did play on the SNES, so the most classic version it can get. And for FF6, FF6 just has the most amazing cast of characters, probably the best cast of characters in my opinion, that even the game doesn't even specify who the main character is, and really leaves it up in the air for us to decide. My favorite character was Locke, not because my name is Lock-On, but just because I really liked Locke's enthusiasm, his theme as well. Yeah, I liked Locke. And there were definitely some weak characters like Strago, Realm, Umaro, others such as Mog as well. But just like the other characters definitely make up for them. And FF6, in my opinion, probably has the second greatest music in the entire franchise. All the main characters, the whole entire cast has like their own themes, along with their own leitmotifs to go with them, and I think that is just genius on the part of Nobuo Uematsu. And for Kefka, the main villain of Final Fantasy VI, I think Kefka is by far the greatest villain in the entire franchise, and his theme song, Dancing Mad, is just insane as well. It's very long and it's very good. Yeah, so honestly, for Final Fantasy VI, opinions aside, I think Final Fantasy VI is probably the greatest Final Fantasy in the entire franchise. With no opinions added, Final Fantasy VI is definitely the best Final Fantasy out there. Now, moving on to Final Fantasy VIII. In my opinion, I think Final Fantasy VIII is the greatest Final Fantasy. Final Fantasy VI aside. I did play it on Steam, but not the remastered version, so I still had a pixelated Squall face for the model, but graphics aside, I think Squall is by far one of the most realistic Final Fantasy protagonists out there, and a lot of people often write him off as being like a wannabe Cloud or really edgy, but I think that is the main point of Squall, because if you really think about it, Final Fantasy VIII is a story about teenage mercenaries being sent out to fight Galbadia, I think. And Squall just really captures that teenage essence that I'm pretty sure all of us went through when we were teenagers. And so, Squall is very, very realistic. That is what I liked about him. And throughout the entire story as well, as he met Rinoa, as their relationship developed into like this whole romance story, he definitely opened up more, and his character development as a whole is one of the best, if not the best, in the franchise. And other than that though, the dual storytelling aspect with Squall and Laguna, I think it really worked well, with like Laguna also being a good protagonist as well. He has a really badass theme, and for number one in music, I have to give it to Final Fantasy VIII. I think Final Fantasy VIII has the most greatest, best music in the entire franchise. And it's most especially because the main theme song, Eyes on Me, and I think Eyes on Me is the greatest Final Fantasy theme song, aside from like the ones after it being Melodies Alive, Steki Dane, Kiss Me Goodbye from 12, My Hands in 13, and Stand By Me in 15. Final Fantasy VIII just hit the nail with Eyes on Me, and Eyes on Me has a lot of leitmotifs throughout the entire game, and I think with all those leitmotifs, it really builds up to the climax when the actual song plays in the Ragnarok, and that moment was just pinnacle, in my opinion. And I know a lot of people often complain about the draw system in Final Fantasy VIII, and yeah, I would have to agree, it was pretty confusing for me. I found out I was playing the game completely wrong up until I fought Raijin and Fujin. Up until then, I only used summons, and then I got my ass handed to me by the boss fight, and then I had to relearn the game entirely. But you know what? Just because the draw system was bad, the fact that they implemented the card game into the draw system, I think that was genius, because the card game is really fun as well. And yeah, going back to music, Final Fantasy VIII has a lot of relaxing music as well, with like Balam Garden or Fisherman's Horizon. And yeah, just to me, Final Fantasy VIII stood out the most. It has a soundtrack that I will probably never forget, along with Final Fantasy VI. And I think just like Squall as a protagonist really edges out the amazing cast of Final Fantasy VI. So to me, Final Fantasy VIII is the greatest Final Fantasy. And with that being said, I guess that is my tier list video. So definitely comment down below if you have any agreements or disagreements. I would definitely like to see some arguments for like some ones I put lower and maybe some sequels as well, because I was planning on playing Final Fantasy XIV, but unfortunately they closed the free trial, and well, I don't know when it'll open up. So yeah, that is my Final Fantasy tier list. And now, hopefully if you watch my War of the Visions videos as well, you know what exactly I might be going for. If Squall ever comes to War of the Visions, you already know, I will get him for sure. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, peace.